Good morning. I hope you all are doing well as we enter the second official week of conflict management. Let me start by saying thank you for completing your introductory activities. It's been great to get to know all of you a little bit better, and I'll have grades and feedback for you on these assignments at the latest by the end of the week. If you haven't already, please make sure to respond to at least 2 other student introductions by Friday. In addition to that, thank you for completing the syllabus and Chapter 1 quiz. This is a great way to get a sense of how these kinds of open note, open book quizzes will play out over the course of the quarter. So I hope that that was helpful in terms of grasping some of the major ideas and concepts in conflict management. And third, thank you for completing that anonymous feedback form. That was a great way for me to get a sense of some of the ways that I can support you in building writing skills and other things like that in the class. For this week, I'm asking you to do a couple different things. First of all, I'd like you to complete the Week 2 quiz. The Week 2 quiz goes over the second chapter of the Jant textbook. So for this week, you'll need to make sure that you've secured a copy of the Jant textbook, either as an ebook, as a purchase online, or as a purchase through the campus store. If you're coming close to the end of the week and you haven't been able to secure your second chapter of Jant, please let me know as soon as possible, and I'll be able to help you with accessing that reading. Otherwise, complete the quiz that covers content from Chapter 2. I'm also asking you to complete the Chapter 2 in writing activity. This activity is divided into 2 different parts. The first part asks you to take a look at some of the resources available online through both the EOU Writing Center as well as the Purdue OWL. The Purdue OWL in particular is a great resource because it goes over some of the guidelines for citing sources in different styles. So for instance, MLA, APA, or Chicago. You can use any one of those 3 for this class, and it's a great way of helping guide you through both in-text citations and a works cited list. In addition to that, some of the things that I look for when it comes to strong writing skills include good use of citations, a strong topic sentence, and good analysis throughout the essay. On Canvas, I've gone ahead and included some of the slides that I like to use in order to help with developing writing skills. Another thing that I'd add as you're thinking about some of the writing assignments in this class is that I'm happy to look at rough drafts or outlines of your major writing projects, including the term paper for this class, if you need any additional support on those. Additionally, we will have the first online study discussion coming up in just a couple weeks, so stay tuned for more information as the week progresses, including some guidelines and a walkthrough of how this assignment is going to play out. So, I'd like to use some of the remaining time to talk about some of the key concepts and ideas that you'll notice in Chapter 2 of Jant. So Chapter 1 of Jant was very much getting into the core of conflict management. Why is conflict something that can actually be a force for good? Rather than resolution, conflict management seeks to maximize the positive outcomes of conflict while avoiding some of the negative outcomes, such as damage to relationships and so on. Chapter 2 builds on this by looking at the role of power. And we can think about power as the degree of influence or control that we have over other people. Not all relationships and conflicts that we have with others are created equal. In fact, a lot of times we'll engage in conflict with people that occupy different levels of power, or power could be the source of the disagreement. For instance, a parent-child relationship or a coworker and a supervisor disagreeing over how to execute a task can be some major sources of conflict. So when we consider some of the asymmetrical or not quite even power relationships that come out in the world, that's an important topic for us to explore in more detail. Another issue that's worth exploring are understanding some of the styles of managing and dealing with conflict, particularly the ways that culture can shape these forms of conflict. For instance, there are certain styles of conflict more common in the East versus in Western cultures. And a lot of these differences can be attributed to more Eastern cultures exhibiting more collectivist styles, involving larger populations and a greater focus on collaboration. Whereas in places like the United States, there's a greater focus on individual approaches and achievement as a way of resolving conflict. So when we think about conflict and the role that power plays, the authors French and Raven suggest that there's 5 major categories of power. The first is legitimate or personal power, and this might refer to the formal ways that you have power over somebody else. If you're a teacher, at the end of the day, you're submitting grades and you're submitting reports on how students do. You have that level of executive authority. Then there's also this idea of referent power, and that ties to the role of charm and charisma, your ability to bring other people in and to gain the support of other people. So for instance, if you've ever seen the classic play Julius Caesar, the character of Mark Antony likes to speak to the public, to address a large audience, and to convince him in order to support him and support late Caesar's cause. In this example, Mark Antony uses his rhetorical skills, his personal relationship with his audience, and so on in order to connect. So it uses those levels of charm and charisma as a way of gaining support and gaining trust from other people. The third type of power to think about is expert power. So we've seen this a lot in discussions surrounding COVID-19, such as individuals such as infectious disease experts and so on. People who hold expertise, background, or authority over a topic based on their own experience and study or focus on that issue can play a big role. If you work for a company and somebody's been involved in that company for over 20 years, they bring expert power that allows you to trust them on how to execute key tasks. There's also reward power, which is the idea that you can provide some type of incentive for completing a task. If you've ever completed a survey because it promises you a chance at winning a new iPhone in a raffle, that's an example of reward power. The people conducting the survey have given you this opportunity as a reward for your work. And then coercive power is the opposite. It's the use of punishment. So if you've ever had a parent tell you that you're going to get a timeout, or you've ever had to give a timeout to a kid, right? That's the use of coercive power, a punishment. We can also understand both power over and power with. Power over often uses things like threats or force to make others follow along. So we can think about a lot of the ways that military or law enforcement can exhibit power over. You don't want to speed, or you'll get a speeding ticket. Power with involves using things like power sharing in order for individuals to work together. So one of the major ideas brought up in this context for this class is the civil rights movement and the work of Dr. King in creating power sharing to engage in community-based civil disobedience and advocacy. We also can see that there's different conflict styles, and these are present both in Eastern and Western approaches, as well as some of the ways that they're merged together. And in the West, under the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode, we can notice that different conflict styles are measured based on how much cooperation and how much assertion are present. So if somebody is both uncooperative or unassertive, they're avoiding, right? They're trying to get out of the conflict altogether and put it out of sight and out of mind. If somebody's cooperative, but they're not very assertive, they're accommodating, which means that it's a lose-win. You're essentially giving over your stake in the issue to somebody else. You say, okay, you can have the other half of the sandwich. Competing is when you are assertive but uncooperative. So if you and somebody else are vying for the same promotion, then you might engage in competing. You and them both want it, and you and them are both trying to get it. With both medium cooperation and medium assertiveness, you have compromising, right? Compromising, some people like to say, is where everybody loses. Or at the very least, people have to give up a little on each side in order to get something that's at least somewhat acceptable for both people. So for instance, we'll compromise by you can have some of these snacks and I'll have half of this sandwich. And then an approach that's both cooperative and assertive is collaboration. Collaborating involves working together with the other person to find a solution that can work for both people. So maybe you say, you know what, you can have the sandwich and snacks, but I'm going to go and pick up some food, and together we can have a really nice picnic. So collaborating involves really working together. It takes a lot of effort and thought to figure out what a collaborative approach might look like, but it can oftentimes yield the best result out of all the options available. Now, meanwhile, in more Eastern cultures, there tends to be five major conflict styles. One is confrontation, and confrontation is not necessarily desirable, but it involves standing up to an authority figure or someone in power. It's a willingness to compromise the relationship. One thing that's important to put into context is that for many non-Western cultures, the idea of harmony or maintaining strong networks with other people is really important. The idea of saving face and maintaining good relationships with other people is important because many non-Western cultures have larger populations and place a greater emphasis on forming relationships with other people. Another approach that can be used in Eastern conflict management styles is obeying publicly while disobeying or disagreeing privately. So for instance, you might agree with a supervisor's rules or guidelines and be supportive of them, but decide you want to take on the project in your own way in a private context. That way you maintain a good relationship while also doing what you feel is right or important. Like with Western styles, compromise or meeting in the middle is a shared strategy. Another strategy is endurance, where you're dealing with a not so good outcome because you value the relationship and you see that as more important. So for instance, you give somebody else your snacks and your lunch as a way of kind of supporting them and supporting the relationship. And then the last major Eastern approach is this idea of severance, where you completely remove yourself from the situation or end the relationship. So severance could involve ending a friendship with somebody that you feel has not been very supportive or kind. We also see that there's a style of approaches that merge both Eastern and Western. So these can include things like constructive diplomacy, where you're engaging in respectful communication with somebody else on areas that you disagree with in order to reach a good conclusion. We see this used a lot in the United Nations, where members of the UN might disagree on certain topics but engage in a respectful way. We also see accommodating, again, acquiescing to somebody else. Constructive controversy might involve something like a public debate or discussion, where the purpose is not necessarily to convince one another, but instead to understand each other better. Concession obliging involves basically providing certain concessions or things the other person wants in order to further the relationship. So maybe you say, okay, you can have the snacks, but let's continue to talk about ways that we can both get something to eat. Superficial compliance is the idea that on the surface you agree with and support an authority figure, but maybe outside of that you take on the project in your own way or you disagree with them in a private way. We also use avoiding in both Eastern and Western cultures. Destructive confrontation is a disagreement or argument in which neither party wins. And then you can also use ignoring, where you push away, you change the subject, or otherwise don't deal with the conflict. The last concept that I wanted to bring up from this chapter is the idea of conflict coaching. Conflict coaching refers to a sort of professional practice and executive style for disputing and dealing with major issues. It involves things such as building rapport, which is the idea of getting to know and having somebody else feel more trusted and confident in you. You can have somebody complete an initial survey or look at the issue or conflict. You can focus on the conflict and try to have a detailed list of the ways to solve the conflict or develop a solution together. And then a conflict coach will help you, based on those potential options, to look at the best solution. So conflict coaching is something we see a lot in the real world, whether it's a mediator or a facilitator in a complex discussion, a counselor or therapist, or somebody like a career coach who's helping you to deal with a challenging scenario. When we put it all together, this chapter and its look at power helps us to understand that power is exercised in different ways, and that power can create unique challenges in terms of how we address conflict. We can look at both Western styles that tend to focus more individually on things like compromise versus competition, and more Eastern styles that focus more on maintaining harmony between groups, and a merging of these approaches that leads to a lot of distinct ways of managing conflict. The best thing to take away here is that there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to managing conflict. There's a lot of disagreements and a lot of issues that impact the entire process, and so it's useful for us to use contextual reasoning. thinking carefully about the context, the situation, and what's going on to develop the most constructive way to manage both power and conflict. So that goes over some of the major things that I wanted to cover for this week. For next week, we'll look into deconstructing conflict and some of the strategies that we can use to de-escalate challenging scenarios. Until then, I hope that you all have an excellent week, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or there's anything else that I can do to support you. Otherwise, I will talk to you again next Monday.